I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course.
All right. I'm now joined by Rick Perlstein, author most recently of Reaganland. Before that, The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, Nixonland, before that, and before that, Before the Storm, about the Goldwater campaign. So welcome, Rick. This is great.
Ben, good to meet you. I love that line. There is no left and right, only up or down. I steal that all the time. And, you know, when I get debates with right wingers, yeah, he knew how to debate, man. Let me tell you.
Yeah, yes, for sure. I mean, it's also interesting in that clip, you know, because he has, you can kind of see the needle he's threading between, you know, like this kind of everything's going to hell, law and order conservatism, and the you know, libertarian rhetoric that he liked on economic issues. So it's, you know, the maximum of free, you know, of individual freedom that's possible within.
Yes, it's called liberty correctly understood, was I think what Edmund Burke called it. Yeah, now just what are we talking about? That was Barry Goldwater's speech, Ronald Reagan's speech for Barry Goldwater the week before the 1964 presidential election. And of course, Goldwater, as I wrote about in my first book, lost in this massive landslide and had people scratching their heads and saying, why wasn't this guy our nominee? Which happened a few times in Reagan's life.
Yeah, and then you know, go into the book before this one. You know, he takes a shot at it in 1976.
Exact same things happens at the Republican convention. He gives the closing speech, and everyone's like, "Why isn't this guy our nominee?"
Yeah, and that actually, one of the things that really stood out for me from the beginning, I think of the beginning of Reaganland. So I have all of these books, all four of those. I have listened to in audiobook version over the course of like a million dog walks and stuff. So I have, you know, sometimes I think back to which one was that in? And
like
also
Pat Metheny says, like all the Pat Metheny group albums can be one long composition,
right?
one long paragraph, one long book.
Right, exactly.
That hasn't, you know, of course, been finished yet.
yeah, and like also sort of feels like it could continue indefinitely. Like I've had the thought many times. It's like I kind of want the narration of the Rick Perlstein summary of whatever's going on. You know, and on January 6th, you know, hundreds of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol at the same time. You know, etc. Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that I got out of, I think, the beginning of Reaganland, that's sort of a surprising part of this story is that Reagan made a decision to essentially throw Ford under the bus in the general election. He didn't really campaign for him.
That's right. So he kind of begins the book, you know, with Gerald Ford having just lost, and a lot of people with very sound reasoning, blaming him personally for Jimmy Carter being president. And it begins with a note of self-pity. The first sentence, I think, is something like Ronald Reagan insisted it wasn't his fault. And that was one of the kind of qualities of Ronald Reagan that both in this book and my previous book, Invisible Bridge, that self-pity that I think was a big part of his makeup that no one really talks about. You know, they talk about his optimism, they talk about his, you know, anger at, you know, kind of all sorts of insurgencies, but he could be quite the whiner. So, you know, he had his own little explanation for why Gerald Ford lost, and it didn't include him.
Right. I mean, what's your read of that? I mean, did he think that, like, was this actually cynical on the level of thinking that if, Ford losing would mean that he'd be less able to have kind of a designated
I mean, that's where you get into that remarkable contraption, the mind of Ronald Reagan, in which, on the level of consciousness, there's just, I'm completely convinced there's no cynicism whatsoever. His ability to kind of turn all sorts of negative emotions that other people would recognize, whether they're, chaos or failure, into some sort of I say at some point in the book that his strongest psychological drive was a belief in his own innocence, right? So yes, I think what you're referring to is if Ronald Reagan wants to be president and comes in second place in the nomination in 1976, it's a pretty good long-term play for the guy who beats him to lose, and then he becomes the heir apparent for the nomination. And since kind of that's exactly what's happens, most normal political analysts, actors, politicians would just presume that this was what he had in mind. And I think to say that he had it in mind is to say that he had it in mind on some part of his subconscious, certainly, but this is the guy who was completely persuaded that when he was, instructing all the members of the Screen Actors Guild during a strike in 1946, to cross a picket line, he was only doing so because he was valiantly fighting the communists who were, trying to take over Hollywood. Even though his allies in that strike were like, there were no communists involved. What are you talking about, right? So, that's the nature of Ronald Reagan. It's really his gift because he projects that sort of innocence and lets his supporters kind of pick up on it, whether it's his own innocence or say the racial innocence of America as a nation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, actually, sorry, there's a little bit of echo. Can you turn down your volume a little bit, maybe? See if that works. Sure. Okay. But yeah. So if nothing else, I mean, Reagan seems to have been very, very good at inventing versions of himself. There's an interesting question about the extent to which he believed them, but inventing versions of himself and his past, that fit with whatever he wanted to say now, right? Like there's a there was some sort of student strike that he was involved in college. It's very unclear what actually happened there.
Yes, the source for this is the wonderful Gary Wills, my fellow Chicagoan, who wrote in his book Reagan's America about part of the most dramatic part of Ronald Reagan's memoir that he wrote, basically preparatory to running for governor in 1966, in which he talks about how, he went to this little college in Illinois called Eureka College. And he completely bought into this sort of pop culture image of what college was all about. You were cheerleaders, sports. And there was a student strike that involved, I'm not even remembering the casus belli, but part of it, had all kinds of, the way he wrote about it had all kinds of, dramatic elements, like the news of the news of the board's decision was all in the newspaper the morning of a big football game, and at the stadium, everyone had their newspapers in front of their faces, and it looked like when they used those cards to spell out words. And Gary Wills just did the basic historian's work of saying figuring out what the dates were. There was no football game on that day and that sort of thing. So it's very clear that when you kind of go to the documentary record, no one remembered him being a leader in the strike and all sorts of stuff like that. And that made him purpose built for Hollywood, right? And for a brand of politics that made Hollywood myth making the alpha and the omega of its presentation to the public. But yeah, I mean, his past is full of all sorts of dramatic things that clearly didn't happen. One of the ways to tell a good Reagan biography from a bad one is to see if they use his memoirs, of which there were two, one after he was president, and one he wrote in 1966, as evidence of anything, because they often contradict each other on basic points, like how he got his nickname Dutch, And then, I found, one of his people who, went to grade school with him said, I don't remember anyone calling him Dutch.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, if
we
I
laugh at our own peril, that's kind of one of the points too. Because
yeah, right. Yeah, and which I mean is also like a big thing that got out of all of these books is that to maybe flatten and simplify the record a little bit. It feels like every time the like Democrats win one election, sort of proclaim that this is it. There's this like been this permanent there's been this permanent alignment in American politics.
Barack Obama won. Do you agree that Nixon land is over?
Right, exactly.
I don't know, man. I think that Abraham Lincoln won in 1860. How'd that work out?
Exactly. Yeah, like it seems like every time, like there are all these points, in the story when, either, look, LBJ has won, therefore there's just this permanent ascendancy, and the GOP is basically going away, or
and Carter, no one notices the same day the GOP wins. That Lyndon Johnson wins by 1 million in California, and the front page headline in the New York Times is literally "White backlash does not develop." That on the same ballot in California, there was an open housing referendum that lost by 1.5 million. Of people saying that liberty means the liberty to not have to rent your apartment to a black person.
Right. And the the iteration of this that brings us to Reaganland, the last book is Jimmy Carter, winning in 1976, which is kind of
pretty gifted mythologist in his own right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so Carter, Carter winning in 76, like sort of treated as he's figured out this like this populist magic, that's going to be allowed, that's going to be used to defeat conservatives forever.
Yeah. Right. And, William Vanden Heuvel just died. Is that a name that's familiar to you?
Mm-hmm.
He was Katrina Vanden Heuvel's dad, and he was, a long time kind of liberal public official. He'd been very close to Robert F. Kennedy and did wonderful things as the head of the prison board in New York. But he fell in love with Jimmy Carter, and he convinced all of liberal New York, which basically meant kind of the liberal intelligentsia of America, that Jimmy Carter had figured out the secret sauce to neutralize what George Wallace was up to. This terror that basically that just kind of cashing in on white resentment was going to be meant no liberal could win ever. But Jimmy Carter beats George Wallace for the primary in Florida, and William Vanden Heuvel basically is the leader of the of the forces who again make the same claim in 1976. And in so doing, help kind of ring down the curtain on a lot of the New Deal's economic legacy, because
right.
Carter embraces austerity politics very hard after running as a liberal Keynesian.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a story that you tell in the book about, on the one hand, Jimmy Carter, sort of being this president who begins the neoliberal turn in Democratic Party politics, really embraces neoliberalism, like and austerity, like a lot of the stuff that basically I think some people sort of vaguely assume that, I don't know, the start of that is like Bill Clinton or something.
Right.
They
had kind of almost identical lines in their 1978 and 1995 State of the Union. Clinton's was the age of big government is over, and Carter's like government cannot cure inflation, it cannot cure poverty. Only individual initiative can do that.
Right. And at the same time that Carter is going in that direction, one of the stories you tell in the book is about the Republicans learning to fall out of love with fiscal discipline. That it had been conservative orthodoxy that if you cut taxes, you have to cut spending. That cutting taxes is like the rule.
Can you hear me?
Sorry about that. I think we flicked out for a second.
Yeah.
So
You're talking
yeah.
about the cutting taxes.
Yeah. So the conservative orthodoxy had been that cutting taxes is like the reward that you get after cutting
It's
spending.
dessert.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It's,
dessert after a healthy meal.
right. That, after you've had your, austerity and, vegetables, then you can have
That's
the
right.
ice cream of tax cuts. But then there were, Laffer and these other right-wing economists, some of whom were like really strange and colorful kooks, who convinced the Republicans that you didn't have to do it that way.
Yeah. One of the kookiest was Jude Wanniski, who was a editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, who claimed to have learned everything he needed to know about economics as a card counter in Las Vegas. Yeah. And then, Arthur Laffer himself, who'd been kicked out of government for these incredibly embarrassing failed budget projections for Richard Nixon. And this guy, Mundell, who kind of grew his hair long and moved to, like, I don't know, Bahamas and a parrot on his shoulder or something like that. I don't remember quite the details. But yes, this was supply side economics. And, the basic predicate of this was, the Keynesian nostrums in the middle of the 70s suddenly seemed not to be working, right? So there was a real kind of intellectual opportunity for those who, wanted to discredit, activist government itself. And there are all sorts of kind of economic, battles going on about who on the right really would be the people to, kind of write the future paradigm, and in a sense, people like Milton Friedman, Ben Stein, these were the good guys because they were the ones who were like, these supply side guys, like, are making no sense at all. And they would, basically write these articles that had, no economic models, but they would say as a matter of faith, this was the Laffer curve. That if you lower
so do you want to say what exactly that is?
The Laffer curve. So Arthur Laffer was this kind of discredited supply side economist, discredited among other economists, right, who came back, by the way, for the age of Trump. But he came up with this thing called the Laffer curve, in which he said that, well, if your tax rate is 0%, you're going to get zero revenue. And if your tax rate is 100%, you're going to get zero revenue because no one will work if they have to pay all their money in taxes. But there's this magic point where those, kind of two extremes cross. That is the ideal tax rate that will maximize revenue. And that cross point is, way, 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 way below what we have now. And if we lower taxes to that magical rate, you literally will have an explosion of economic activity that will actually increase revenue to the government. And you won't have to cut anything, right? And Jude Wanniski was kind of the most brilliant sort of phrase maker of this group. And he referred to this as the two Santa Claus theory. So there was this old saying in Republican politics that, this is why we can't beat these Democrats. No one shoots Santa Claus. Right. And this is an old style of Democratic politics that in a lot of ways, Joe Biden has kind of tried to bring back. It's basically the government is Santa Claus. The government writes you checks. It redistributes income. One way it did this was, for example, to bring it back to Jimmy Carter, was public works projects like dams, that weren't always necessary, but not only created a lot of great blue collar jobs for people who didn't have college degrees, but they made these amazing lakes where you could go fishing, right? So if I'm a big fishing fan. So if you go across the South, there's all these wonderful lakes that look like overgrown rivers that are named after dead Democratic senators, right? Because those are the guys who kind of appropriated the funds. So that's Santa Claus. And Jude Wanniski's like, we can't beat him at this game, but we got our own Santa Claus. We get to lower everyone's taxes. And one of the ideas behind slow supply side taxes was it wasn't just, we're going to lower the capital gains rate, although that was certainly part of it. It wasn't just we're going to lower the top marginal rate, although that was part of it. The idea was we're going to cut taxes across the board. And the way this ended up manifesting was a bill to cut taxes by 30 percentage points over 3 years. And of course, unfortunately, for these guys, since we have a progressive tax system, that helps out rich people a lot more than it helps poor people, right? Because it's not a progressive cut. But nonetheless, what you could say to every American who has an income and pays income taxes, which was, most by 1977, 78, 79, and 1980, was that, you get a tax cut, and you get a tax cut, and you get a tax cut, and you get a tax cut. Oh, and these guys, they want to raise your taxes, right? And lo and behold, here comes Jimmy Carter, who gets elected. I've actually re-reviewed this history, re-researched it for a review I'm doing of a new Jimmy Carter biography, and he was absolutely adamant that no one would have to sacrifice anything under a Carter presidency. One of the last debate he had with Gerald Ford was the moderator, being a good, kind of elite journalist, let's say, under your presidency, how are you going to ask Americans to sacrifice? Yeah. And Gerald Ford says, well, people are probably going to have to sacrifice. This is tough times. And Jimmy Carter says, basically, he kind of hems and haws, and he has one of those answers that you can tell they don't want to answer, right? Because he doesn't really use grammatical sentences. But he starts out saying, under a Carter presidency, people will have to sacrifice much less. And one of the things he does in basically his first weeks as president was he unilaterally announces 55 dam projects that he's canceling. And he doesn't tell any of the politicians whose political careers rely upon this particular Santa Claus. And he doesn't tell his interior secretary, who gets off a plane at a governor's meeting and is nearly, nearly, horsewhipped by a bunch of governors who are going to lose their dams. Right. And so one side has Santa Claus and the other side has Scrooge. And that was Jimmy Carter's doing.
Yeah, you should mention, by the way, so that the Laffer curve, one of the things you mentioned in the book is that...
it's also complete BS, right? I mean, obviously, I don't need to tell your intelligent listeners that, it was completely made up and didn't work.
Yes, yeah, I mean, this is something that that Laffer came up with, he was at a meeting with Dick Cheney, right? And he
wrote on the back of a napkin. He's like, let me show you, Dick. And then he goes to this fancy expense account restaurant with starched linen napkins. And he's like, oh, damn. And he sees there's cocktail napkins at the bar. And famously, he, writes it down. And Dick Cheney is, chief of staff for Gerald Ford. And he's trying to convince, unsuccessfully as it turns out, Gerald Ford, what he was able to convince Ronald Reagan, which was a very Reaganite idea. A miracle of the loaves and fishes, that you just unleash the American people's native genius and, get rid of the dead hand of government, and next thing everyone in the streets are paved with gold.
Right. And of course, I think part of the magic of this is that it's a curve, right? I mean, that looks like it looks like economics.
A big part of kind of the intellectual infrastructure of the right that's kind of coming about at this time, the Heritage Foundation, is they're very good at producing basically study-like objects, that have big words and charts and graphs, and a credulous press is able to say, wow, the right is really kind of entering full bore into the battle of ideas.
Right, but this is even when they have there's study-like objects that are sometimes presented in academic journal-like entities, that aren't based on peer review or anything like that, and these. So that you have the graph, it looks really nice. There's no footnote saying this is the data that's based on.
No, there's no data. It's just something he drew up in his head. There's no study that says this is the ideal, point. He claimed all the Jude Wanniski, wrote up the article in Irving Kristol's magazine, The Public Interest, which was, this magazine that actually did publish actual studies. So, it had a sort of, kind of intellectual veneer to it, but Kristol was this guy who basically had, this former Marxist who became one of the pluperfect neoconservatives who devoted his life to convincing corporate America that they needed to fund these study-like objects to rescue freedom. And Jude Wanniski comes up with all kinds of crazy, cockamamie historical examples, going back to the czars, about, how this stuff has been proven time and again. And one of the funniest is he's like, if you look at what, happened in American economic policy between he said something like 1923 and 1929, that's the perfect example. and you're like, well, something happened in
Why is
1929.
29 the cutoff? Why don't we go to 30?
But it was good enough for a lot of members of Congress. And one of the shocking things about reading this, and really the only part, there are two parts writing that kind of really made me kind of tear up. And one was writing about Harvey Milk,
Right.
the San Francisco City Council member, gay, who was assassinated, and his murderer basically got away with it. He was a cop, right? A former cop and a colleague of his in the city council, but also writing about how much of the Democratic Party just signed on to this tax cutting mania, such that they were literally trying to outdo the Republicans when it came to things like capital gains cuts, because nothing else seemed to be working, right? So what were they supposed to do?
Yeah. So, looking, you mentioned Crystal, who's like the sort of, I think like the perfect embodiment of what people think of when they think of neocons, somebody who is like a Trotskyist at City College in 1930,
Totally.
whatever. And then, went to the right. I remember it was a line that made me laugh. I don't remember who you were quoting in the book about how he'd published this op-ed saying that corporations need to stop funding traditional charity and start funding, people who are going to defend their, economic freedom or, whatnot. And, you quoted somebody saying that, that he did everything short of including his name and address.
Steve Blumenthal in his book, The Rise of the Counter-Establishment. I thought you were going to refer to one of his op-eds in the Wall Street Journal where he said, we don't have to worry about deficits because eventually there'll be a Democratic president. We can blame it on him.
Right. Which is, honest. So one of a big part of the big story being told across all of these books about the rise of contemporary conservatism, from Goldwater into the rise of Reagan, is basically the larger story. And which is used, like some of these people that you're tracing are used in a instrumental way, like by Nixon. I remember a line about how if you really want something done right, you need to find yourself a right-wing exuberant.
Healthy right-wing exuberant.
Yes. But Nixon wasn't that. He just, he was just happy to use that. But in particularly Reagan land, we see the elements coming together that become kind of the right-wing coalition of later years. So, part of that, you just mentioned Harvey Milk, is this evangelical current that is trying to push back against attempts to pass the ERA, is very concerned with countering gay rights.
Sex is the Achilles heel of liberal Democrats. That's what one of these new right guys says. People are so angry at their daughters going out and having sex, and this is the people who are encouraging this stuff are all part of the Democratic coalition, and we'll just slice it right. We'll slice them right there.
Yeah, and that's and of course a lot of those are the shock troops, right? But then you also use this phrase a lot, boardroom jacobins.
Right.
Do you want to go into what you mean by that?
So, I mean, yes, we're talking about a confluence of factors that kind of grows the right such that they can create this kind of majority coalition, which isn't necessarily even on a voting level, necessarily voting for, right-wing ideas as such. That's where kind of the Reagan, the kind of figurehead comes in as someone who just, is such a exciting person to cast your lot with, even if you're just an ordinary voter. But if you're talking about kind of the cadres who turned the Republican Party to the right and really kind of were the activist class, we mentioned someone like Irving Kristol, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the important part about this story is that, through, the years of what, the French call les 30 glorieuses, these golden years of capitalism, in which basically Keynesianism in America is, and the labor movement and all these things we know so well are delivering the world the first mass middle class. I like to say, you could, grow up in a house at an outhouse,
right,
and like end up with a vacation house, even if you didn't get a college degree, just by kind of working hard and playing by the rules near a steel mill or, car factory or whatever. That corporate America largely, signs on to, what is understood to be a liberal consensus. And this encompasses everything from, not challenging unions in their elections, seeing unions as kind of in this corporatist way as kind of an equal partner in what you do. The president always would have, a businessman and a union person, at a big meeting, but also, really sort of not so much kind of a disinclination to fight regulation as kind of a slackening of the capacity to do so. So one of the striking things I'm able to write about is how weak corporate lobbying was,
Right.
in the 60s, right? So, by the time, it's really striking. I mean, we all know because, readers of Nixon Land, let's say, and people who are familiar with the story know that, the Great Society basically lasts, 2 years, 1964, 1965, 1966, let's say 3 years, between the Kennedy assassination and the Congress that's elected in, 1964, passes Medicare, Medicaid, the first federal aid to education, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all this amazing stuff. And then boom, 1966, based on this backlash I write about, in Nixon Land over, basically Black people trying to live in your neighborhood, whether you're in the North or the South, it's just stopped dead in its tracks. And 1967, Lyndon Johnson can't even get a little $20 million bill to control rodents in slums across America. But one of the things I'm able to point out in Reagan Land is this new wellspring of liberal energy immediately takes its place, which is consumerism. And, I think a lot of times it gets a bad rap on the left, and I don't really think it should. I mean, what we're talking about is just, for example, and this is all the stuff associated with the original rise of Ralph Nader as this amazing dynamo. We're talking about, OSHA, the first federal agency where people can go in the factory and make sure people are not getting their fingers chopped off. We're talking about, meat safety laws that are the first, updates, since, the days of Upton Sinclair. We're talking about bank regulations that, basically say you have to say exactly what the interest rate is in big letters, on your credit card bill. So it's a ton of stuff that really, in a way, interestingly enough, that the Great Society never does, takes on corporate power in a pretty direct way. And, the other part of this that spurs kind of the boardroom Jacobins is, the environmental movement, which has a really remarkable string of successes. And my favorite story of all time, because it just speaks to a kind of, we've beaten up on the Democrats' turn to austerity, but they had a lot of tough mofos. And one of them was, this guy who was, the senator from Maine, Edwin Muskie, was the vice presidential candidate in 1968, but he was the big environmentalist in the Senate. And he was proposing basically what became CAFE standards. Your fleet had to have, if you had a car company, they had to have an average fuel economy of X. And the car company said to him, we can't do it. We don't have the technology. And he said, I don't care. Literally. I mean, this is literally a quotation. I mean, a paraphrase. I don't care if you can't produce a safe, clean car, you don't deserve to produce cars. And I can kind of imagine Joe Biden doing that. I can't really imagine, Barack Obama saying that to like the head of Facebook, or the head of Google, And then my other favorite story is that his chief lobbyist for the environmental committee, this guy named Leon Billings, one of the car companies comes up to him with a bunch of negotiating points on a sheet of paper and says, why don't we, start with this? And Billings literally folds it into a paper airplane and sails it over his head in the hearing room, So that's what leads us to the brink of this new coalition, this new turn in the business coalition. And this is also a time of, declining profits. This is where my kind of the most Marxist part of the book, where you basically have the third world, saying all these resources that you guys need to have your capitalist economy, they're ours.
Right.
And this is the OPEC oil embargo, and even like, Jamaica, like forms a cartel to control the bauxite market for aluminum. And for all sorts of reasons, these among them also, the fact that the labor movement is really militant in the early 70s and has, some really good wage gains, they're losing profits. And basically one of the stories I tell in Reaganland is them saying, wow, this is big business, right? I'm talking about kind of Fortune 500 blue chip companies, often consumer facing, publicly traded. And they kind of had these rivals who were kind of the Goldwater Coalition, these smaller organizations that were kind of just traded in kind of regionally or nationally and were family owned. And they were always the reactionaries. They were the people who were starting the John Birch Society. And all these companies are like, look, you got to do what we've been doing, fight this stuff tooth and nail. And they win this kind of debate within the capitalist class. And they begin organizing, they begin, basically breaking labor laws on purpose because they know that it won't cost them enough to have any effect on their bottom line. They form ad hoc coalitions to do things like destroy a consumer agency that Ralph Nader wanted to put together. And they begin organizing behind a presidential candidate. Now, one of the fun things about the book is it's not originally Ronald Reagan. It's this forgotten guy named John Connally. But eventually they come around after, basically being terrified of the guy for being a nut. They come around to Ronald Reagan really only in the spring of 1980. And so that's one of the confluences, along with these new right people, the kind of people who are saying sex is the Achilles heel, and they're organizing preachers like Jerry Falwell. And these are two new coalitions in the conservative part of the conservative coalition that are kind of the engine driving the Reagan movement.
Yeah, I mean, you use this broad term a lot in the book, the new right, which of course now is not at all new, but what does that term refer to?
Yeah, it's an interesting word. It's one of those words that's used like almost always wrong. People say Goldwater is part of the new right, right? I mean, it was a very specific thing, and it actually kind of riffed off New Left. New Left is this great new force. We're the new right. And it was basically a lot of them came from kind of working class backgrounds, and we would now call them kind of conservative populists. And they had, but it was a very small cadre of people, right? Like 4 or 5 main people who kind of formed these interlocking organizations. That one of the things that they did was, because they believed the conservative Republican establishment was so kind of timorous, kind of had bought into the system. Their epithet was country club Republicans. They pioneered all sorts of just ruthless tactics, right? One of them is, kind of direct mail, which really resembles the kind of stuff we saw on Facebook in the 2016 election, kind of targeted ads that, just kind of look for the most kind of tender fissures in the other side's coalition. That was direct mail, right? If you don't send us, $10 to elect this senator, your children are going to watch sex demonstrations in their classroom. It's almost that bald, right? Mm-hmm. But then also, the use of the new campaign finance law passed after Watergate, which basically empowers political action committees as a way to kind of weaken parties, right? And kind of, encourage more citizen action in politics, which turns out to be a loophole that makes it really easy to bundle your employees' contributions or to raise money, using direct mail. And, the National Conservative Political Action Committee, pioneers, the most kind of negative campaign tactics that anyone had seen in senatorial campaigning, maybe since, Upton Sinclair ran for governor in the 1920s, and they were proud of it, right? They were completely proud that they just skirted right up to the edge of the rules. They were completely antinomian. They're completely nihilist, and they're like, we want power no matter what because we're fighting for civilization. And one of the main guys that had the National Conservative Political Action Committee was so cynical that he's one of the leaders of this movement that's completely getting ahead of steam based on the most virile, vicious kind of anti-gay hatred, right? That's one of their main flywheels. And it turns out he is gay, and he dies of AIDS in 1986.
Right.
Not a nice group of people.
Yeah, right. And like, I think one of the things about this core group of people that really comes out in this presentation is their, I mean, and I guess also in that detail, is their willingness to sort of glom on to any issue that can be used as a way of separating separating like people who might be susceptible to their appeals from everybody else, even whether it exactly fit what they had been talking about before.
Right. They were very opportunistic. They called it organizing discontent. So one of these guys, Paul Weyrich, one of the main guys, who became so he launched onto what were then called the social issues, basically issues involving kind of sexuality in the family. Guns was one of them, but he did it totally opportunistically because that's where the public was, right? They were good issues to organize with. And he's like, well, we can use them to do things like get people to realize how evil unions are, right? That's almost a quote. Now, he kind of gets high in his own supply, and by the time he dies, he's such a far-right Christian Reconstructionist that he's talking about Christians to actually leave society altogether and form their own communes because society has become so sinful and the right has failed so miserably. But like I say, fun bunch of cats.
Yeah. And I guess one thing, since we are nearing the last part of the time that we've got today, that we haven't really talked about, and I think might be an interesting way of connecting the story that you're telling in these books with some of what's happened since then, is about foreign policy, because thinking about this, like if nothing else, there is an interesting shift. I mean, usually when people tell me that, there's been this like weird, partisan realignment, and they don't, there's a kind of theory of politics where you have, populists in different parties who aren't really, I tend to be pretty skeptical. I think that I want to know, it's like, okay, if you're talking about Republicans, tell me what their position on the minimum wage is, and I'll tell you how much they've changed. But there is at least an interesting rhetorical shift between like Trumpism as the sort of current face of American conservatism, and some of this past stuff, at least on the face of it, maybe not really, because I mean, there are tons of continuity.
Look at the number of people killed in drone strikes since kind of like the minimum wage.
Right. You could make the same point there, right? That Trump.
How are you framing this question?
Well, that at least rhetorically, there's an interesting shift, because if you think about like the conservatives in Reagan land, who were like apoplectic about the thought that Jimmy Carter was going to give up the Panama Canal, and the way that a certain kind of MAGA conservative at least pretends to want a much less interventionist foreign policy.
Yeah, that is a super interesting theme all through the history of conservatism that in a lot of ways was kind of buried by the Cold War. So in the early Cold War, I'm talking about the post-war Cold War, post-World War II Cold War, there was, a group of, former isolationists, very powerful in the Midwest, people like the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who was talking about forming his own, third party in 1956 when he died because he considered the Eisenhower Republicans to be too internationalists. But there was this interesting attempt to kind of be anti-communist and isolationist at the same time, which made for some very, very weird ideological contortions. But certainly kind of by the 1960s and the Vietnam War, the idea of conservatism, it didn't really have any strong isolationist elements to it, or if it did, they were pretty buried. I think that they were kind of considered themselves kind of a quiet, kind of silenced remnant, maybe the Paleocons and the Rockford Institute and something like that. But, when I went to the, I think it was the 2004, no, I think this would have been the 2008, I don't know, they all run together. Maybe it was the 2012 Republican Convention. And I remember that both Condoleezza Rice and one other person gave kind of traditional America as the light unto the nations, kind of interventionist, kind of internationalist speeches, and kind of on the verge of being kind of, booed, right?
Right.
And so I think as long as, kind of there was a really kind of good sort of transcendent enemy to kind of beat up on, whether it was communists or Muslims, great, kick some ass, take names. But I think that there's always kind of been a vulnerability at the grassroots. I mean, often these are the folks who are fighting and dying, So, Trump certainly took advantage of at least a mood that existed on the grassroots on the right that was disgusted with what, gets the label, globalism, right? Now, you can kind of, when you actually cash it out, I'm not sure the kind of relationship Donald Trump had with Saudi Arabia, really kind of rhymes with globalism, kind of anti-globalism.
Yeah, and assassinating Khashoggi, and there's a lot of
the Democratic Party, the Democratic left has not really kind of been able to get a kind of intellectual foundation for a kind of anti, let's say globalist kind of. I mean, left-wing foreign policy is a tricky thing, because we could form a decent American social democracy, but we'll probably still have 1,000 overseas military bases,
right.
And every piece of Pentagon hardware will have a screw or a nut, made in like every of 435 congressional districts. I mean, military Keynesianism is just so firmly entrenched. So that is, kind of interesting. Jimmy Carter made some interesting feints in the direction of kind of anti-communism at the beginning of his term, and completely fell by the wayside. He basically ran as a hawk, kind of trying to out Reagan. By the time of the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, making the terrible misjudgment that this was somehow this sort of attempt by the Soviet Union to kind of get a beachhead to the Persian Gulf, instead of this pack up that had
There's
at each other's throats,
notorious.
You can watch The Americans. They're pretty good.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. There's that notorious Zeb Brzezinski line where he's bragging about having lured the Afghans into the Russian trap, which seems like maybe not something to be proud of. In my God,
the big new Brzezinski.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's like Dr. Strangelove, man, unbelievable. But Carter hired him and he didn't fire him. So that's on him.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Is there? So, are you going to keep going?
I got to go in a couple of minutes.
No. I meant with the book. So you're going to keep going?
Oh, I'm going to go in a different direction.
Okay.
But I think I'm thinking about putting together a collection of my journalism, which I've been writing since 2003. Kind of I've been writing it in dialogue with the histories I've been writing. So I'm. Once I mention this, probably a publisher will get a hold of it and try and do it. But people always say, "Why don't you write Trumpland?" And I say, "Well, I kind of have. I've been writing this journalism about what's been happening on the right all along. So maybe my collection of journalism will end up being called Trumpland." But it's something I want to pull together. It would start, with the first big story I covered as a journalist was the California recall in 2003. Which basically is a bunch of conservatives saying a Democrat doesn't have any legitimacy to govern this state, and came up with a bunch of kind of crazy culture war issues to terrify people. And Arnold Schwarzenegger rode in his Hummer, the basically the first vehicle on American streets, which looked like a riot tank, and he's able to become the governor of California and one of many harbingers of the Trumpified Republican Party to come.
Right. I'll let that. All right. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thanks, Ben. Good luck.
Thanks.